Hi, my name is Jacob Lepic, and you're listening to UC3P. We rely on a vast network of nonprofit organizations to solve some of the most complex societal problems of today. But historically, the data on these organizations has been surprisingly sparse. How do we know what's working, or which programs are working on what problems, or how much money is spent? It turns out that tax filings can help us answer these questions. IRS 990 forms are an administrative dataset published by the IRS about nonprofit organizations nationwide. But it's only in the past few years that this data has been accessible to the public and applied for our benefit. And this is a result of the efforts of our guest. Today, we're speaking with the former director of data science at Charity Navigator and current co-founder of Applied Nonprofit Research, David Boronstein. His work has produced Open990.org, a publicly available database of nonprofit information, which allows researchers, citizens, and nonprofit professionals access to the information they need about their sector. So, David, you previously worked with Charity Navigator. You actually founded Applied Nonprofit Research, which is an organization that works with the 990 dataset. Can you tell us about your work with Open990.org and the history of the 990 dataset?
So first of all, I want to clarify for those listening, there's really two different sources of 990 data. So the IRS has been making images of paper filings and eventually rendered paper filings from electronic filings for many, many years. But in 2016, the IRS, as a result of a Freedom of Information Act lawsuit that they lost, they decided to really open the floodgates of electronic filing information. And so they began publishing every electronically filed 990PF or 990EZ that came in 2011 or after. And that's for any tax period, just as long as it came in 2011 or after. They began posting these data in XML format to an S3 repository. That's a kind of data storage.
And an S3 repo is a kind of data storage in the cloud through Amazon Web Services that you can access through the internet.
But they didn't post all of them, and eventually they removed all of them from the website. And I ultimately, after spending some time at Charity Navigator on it, then more time at Charity Navigator, I became sort of obsessed with making these data accessible. I really felt that what was there was incredibly important and valuable to society, and really just kind of ridiculous that the thing that stood between using it and sort of a useless pile of precious information was the format. So I began what I thought was going to be a fairly short project to make sense of these data, and it's taken me about 3 years to develop a system that allows me to very quickly move through the many subtle changes that have occurred in the format of these filings and allow me to extract any information that I want, which I can now do quite reliably, but it was quite a process to get there.
Data is frequently messy. It's difficult to access, much less apply. When David Boronstein first came across the IRS's data on the Amazon Web Services, he was completely at a loss for what he was looking for.
And I started Googling, the natural response to things these days, of what to do with these data, and the only thing I could find was a single Reddit post, now deleted, that said, what the heck do you do with these 990 data on AWS? That was it. There was no other information to make sense of these data. So I eventually began just reverse engineering them.
Data scientists have a variety of different tools to use to analyze big data. But by today's standards, the IRS 990 dataset isn't that big. It consists of about 3.7 million forms. But they're quite complicated, and each form can have thousands of different fields. And across each year, these forms might actually change.
And so the first thing that we did as a community, and got involved with a working group that was already starting to look at these, but we pulled together this event at the Aspen Institute in Washington, D.C., where a couple dozen people sort of did what I'd been doing, just look at these poorly documented schemas.
A schema is like a map for the data. Field names can be quite complex or quite general or quite confusing. So a schema allows us to identify what each field is, even if the field changes over the years.
They were at least something. And a few examples of returns and the paper filing representation of those same returns, and start to try to build a Rosetta Stone, which is what this concordance was, of how to get information out of these filings. And that really jump-started things. That first one was the 990 Datathon. The second was the Validatathon, to start to validate some of these, what we call mappings, these links that we were making between the representation of the data in the XML and the representation of the data on the paper form. And that was far less successful. And it confirmed a suspicion that I was beginning to harbor, which is that these data were sufficiently complex that once you had cleared the first hurdle of just beginning to figure out what you were looking at, you can't have anybody come in off the street and just start to look at it and make a contribution, even if they were fairly proficient. So it ended up being something that my co-founder and I, Heather Kogelmass, decided that we would focus on for a while. And we thought that this is something that in a couple of months of nonstop focused work, we'd be able to completely sort out. And it ended up being that you really needed to distill a conceptual model, first of all, of what you were looking at. That first you needed to go from the XML representation to what it corresponds to in the paper forms, which itself changes over time, without worrying about what it means, just what line number you're talking about and how that's labeled. And then you need to go from what that line number is labeled to what it means, which may vary even for an identically described field from one type of form to the next or from one year to the next.
Private foundations can fill out the 990 PF, and very small nonprofit organizations can fill out the 990 EZ, requiring very little information. When we look at this data set, do you find that we gain a comprehensive understanding of the nonprofit sector, of what types of organizations exist?
Well, right now we're looking at a subset, and that definitely limits our ability to understand the sector as a whole. So for one thing, only about 2/3 of organizations are e-filing at all right now. So you have 1/3 of organizations filing on paper, and a lot of those are older and more established organizations that have resisted e-filing because they feel that since the e-file really requires you to conform to the structure of the form, rather than allowing you to just say see Schedule O on everything and then attach something in a format that you feel better represents your operations, these organizations have resisted it because they feel that they state the financials only as described in the rules of the 990, there's the instructions of the 990, then it's going to make them look a lot worse than they are. I think that for the same reason that standardized testing can give us some valuable information about students within demographic group, even if there may be some problems in evaluating individual students based on the same standardized tests. I think that it's exactly the inclusion of those organizations that feel that the numbers might not be telling the story they want that's going to be most important in allowing us to understand what's going on in the sector. But that being said, we can learn quite a bit by looking at the set of organizations that are there, because we have so much historical data and because it is a very large number of organizations. We just have to be careful in making statements about the sector. Until all organizations are required to file, we have to be very, very careful. But even once they are, starting next year, to electronically file, churches aren't required to file at all, religious organizations as a result of the First Amendment. Certain political groups, 527s, their filings don't appear in this data set. Schedule B is redacted. That's the one that contains who donated to the organization. For all public charities, it's only included in private foundations. So we really need to be careful in what kind of generalizations we want to make from these data. I think that where we're able to get the most value from these data are when we're asking very targeted questions, either about a small number of organizations over time or about a large subsection of the sector, say everybody within a geographic locale.
So what information can you glean from this data? Or conversely, what can't you learn from this data?
We can really start to get into some very interesting questions about how organizations change and evolve, what kinds of indicators exist that will determine whether an organization will grow or shrink. A lot of interesting financial forecasting can be done with the data that's available. What you cannot do, and I think that this is so incredibly important to emphasize, you absolutely cannot do with these data, is evaluate the merit or the impact or the efficiency or the efficacy or the quality of a nonprofit. That information is not available from these filings, and it is absolutely wrong-headed to attempt to judge a nonprofit based on its financials. It would be as wrong-headed as to judge the moral worth of a person based on their credit score.
After a few intensive years of cleaning, there's a lot that we can do with this data set. For one, it can inform our approach to donations. It can help identify red flags, and it can be a due diligence enforcer.
If you discover, we come across organizations all the time that really don't seem to be doing much with their money that's being donated to them, or they spend an enormous percentage of the money that comes in on fundraising. Start to wonder, what is their relationship to their fundraising apparatus or the consultants that they use for fundraising? There's an obvious one that's coming immediately to mind, the Trump Organization. They were forced to dissolve, after it became clear that their operations were plainly violating the terms of 501c3. So I actually had a chance to meet the district attorney who was responsible for that prosecution. And she told me that her office found out about, a state attorney general, not district attorney. Her office found out about these violations from an investigation by the New York Times, which was presumably looking at these filings. It is so difficult to work with these data, and the enforcement officials are not generally equipped to do the kind of deep digging that needs to be done to discover, wrongdoing. That it's only when the public is looking at these data and putting millions of eyeballs on these organizations do we start to discover what actually has been hiding in plain sight the whole time.
Answering a due diligence question, or, for instance, is the nonprofit doing what it says it's doing with donations, is much more straightforward than understanding how much that money helped one person.
Right. Think about the ways in which, for example, operating a soup kitchen in a particular locale, to choose one that seems like it should be fairly obvious what it's doing, might actually be affecting the people who are living in the area served by that soup kitchen. It's going to have very positive effects for some people, and it could be having negative effects for others. That soup kitchen could have ripple effects for the community that surrounds it, for the kind of community that develops around it, for the businesses that are operating near it, and the ultimate effects of its beneficiaries, depending on how it goes about its operations, and whether it's cannibalizing, for example, the operations of some other soup kitchen, which is nearby and which might be more effective at its mission, could be very difficult to tease out. And knowing that they spend very little of their money on overhead or on paying their employees or on advertising or fundraising doesn't tell you anything